Oh, pleasure, absolutely. Pleasure. Yeah, always. Don't hesitate to ask.
You're on tape, Michael.
Indeed. Okay, let us go ahead and get started. So today we will continue our discussion of Confucianism. We'll play it by ear, but probably that will take roughly half of the class. And then we will turn to the beginning of our discussion of Buddhism, which we will then continue next week. And then that following week, we will have a final discussion of the implications of these three very different approaches. Now, in terms of today's opening portion, the way we will structure this is I will open by saying a few more words, both in response to Roberto Unger's statements at the end of last class, as well as a few statements about the possible ways of reconstructing Confucianism in the world to come. I will try to be brief because we'll want to then use that to open up our discussion. So after I speak, Roberto Unger will give a response to that. And then as always, we will open it up to you all. And again, we'll play it by ear. So we're thinking probably this will be roughly half the class. But if the discussion is lively, we are happy to rethink that. So, to quickly return to the issue of Confucianism, both responding to Roberto's closing comments as well as opening up our discussion of the reconstruction, let me very briefly say one of the concerns I would have with the way you were giving the critique at the very end of the class is it strikes me that there's a danger here that we would lose part of what the real challenge that Confucianism would offer us. Again, regardless of whether we agree with it or not, but part of the excitement of doing comparative philosophy is it should allow us to challenge some of our assumptions and see if some of the things we take for granted or even hold very dearly perhaps are dangerous in certain ways and therefore need to be rethought. And of course, it goes the other way too. So hopefully the process of reconstruction will happen through that work. And the reason I'd like to introduce my thoughts this way is it strikes me that to begin with one of the metaphors you used, that Confucianism is an attempt to humanize a world. So you create a little pocket of humanity in the darkness. And what that would mean in terms of practice, largely an acceptance of the world we're born into that you try to humanize in certain ways. Which also led to your argument that therefore, unlike this first project we've been discussing, which in its full implications can be revolutionary, Confucianism in its full implications for these reasons tends to lead toward conservatism. And let me use this as a jumping off point, both to respond, but then turn to the issue of reconstruction, particularly on that issue of conservatism, which I think you're right is a key issue we'll need to work through. So to begin with that vision of the darkness and humans creating a moment of humanity, or more broadly in an historical perspective, trying to some extent humanize an existing order, the disagreement I would have is that undermines first the transformative implications of this approach, because the approach by definition, I think this is why it's set up as it's set up, is to say, assume that the world that we are living in now is largely a product of human construction. The world, including much of what we perceive to be the natural world, which again is largely a product of human domestication, and assume as well that most of that work of construction has happened through practices and customs that we happen to have fallen into. Those practices have been accumulating for tens of thousands of years at this point. And so assume, therefore, that the world we were born into is not only constructed, it's probably been constructed poorly. Even if specific aspects where some of those customs were developed for very good reasons and responded very effectively at a certain historical moment, That may or may not be the case now. They may just be continuing because they become customs that have become entrenched in our traditions. And again, a lot of them have developed simply because people started doing them, and that has simply continued. So the reason I mention this is built into the system is a sense that take for granted we must transform ourselves in the world we're living in. Beginning, of course, with the self, and this is a key point that we'll be getting back to, you're beginning with the seemingly common mundane aspects of your life, right? So it begins, ideally at a young age, trying to break out of the patterns you have fallen into. A lot of that work early on, as we discussed, is being done through ritual training that is trying to train you to better see the world around you, better sense the complexity of the world around you, better sense the messiness of other humans as well as the messiness of the world around you. Also, you're being trained to sense the degrees to which little things we are doing are helping to create that world around us, right? So the example I mentioned last week, this person is just a mean person, that other person is a nice person. You slowly are being trained to realize, no. People are messy, but they fall into patterns, and little things I'm doing are creating those responses, and therefore, very importantly, little things I could shift would alter those responses. And ideally, therefore, you are slowly transforming yourself by transforming the world around you, by altering the relationships around you, and slowly being trained to create a world where everyone in this immediate mundane surroundings, immediate friends and families, would slowly be transformed in ways that would allow us to flourish. And again, that's intentionally left open-ended as to what that would mean. It would mean radically different things in different contexts, but the training process is sensing this messiness, sensing the degrees to which we fall into these patterns, and sensing how we could therefore alter them so we could begin to flourish. And out of that training process, again, beginning at the very seemingly mundane, you are then working out to pose the question for larger socio-political economic issues. How are those exact same patterns playing out in the world at large? How are they equally coming set in very predefined patterns that hold people in very rigid hierarchical relationships? And how would you begin to alter those? So built into the system is, or built into the even way of framing it, is a notion that you must transform yourself, and you are transforming yourself as a beginning stage to transforming the world around you. So in terms of the concern that this would lead to conservatism, that I think is not quite the case. But there is a significant philosophical difference here, which is why it's correctly motivating the concern. And let me immediately turn to that and then deal with the issue of reconstruction in terms of how we would deal with it. It is absolutely true, as you said, that there is a tremendous suspicion in this tradition of radical revolutionary projects, an extreme suspicion. The view being that if I, right now, try to come up with a brand new ism that will perfectly lead to flawless human flourishing in the world to come, almost assuredly, that ism I would be creating would be based upon very restrictive patterns of thinking I have fallen into. It would be based upon a very restrictive understanding of what humans are capable of. An example of this, as I mentioned last week, is every single ism that's ever been created. Right? It's humans inherently are X, inherently are self-interested creatures. They inherently are figures who are greedy. And you build the world accordingly, which from this perspective, by definition, is going to be a limiting vision. And a third concern, a grand revolutionary project that I personally would come up with, even if, God forbid, people actually listened to me and followed me, if that were to happen, the point is, the way these isms work is you tend to focus on what we think of as the big things, right? Let's immediately overthrow the government and create a radically different economic and political structure. From this perspective, not only, again, are you going to be basing that new vision on a very limited vision of human potentials, you also are not going to be dealing with a place where real transformation begins. You can change a government, you can overthrow a government and put in place a new one, and meanwhile, all of the daily ways that we interact, that include all the forms of discrimination, they're just inherent in our way of being, aren't being changed. Which is why, historically, you can overthrow a government and chillingly, not much ever seems to happen after that. In other words, what we tend to think of as the way to create revolutionary change, I think historically has been proven to often not be the way to create real change. And from this perspective, I think there's a very powerful argument as to why. And why, if you're not changing the daily stuff, patterns of discrimination can simply continue for generations, regardless of altering a governmental structure. Now, this does raise your concern, however, which is, well, but wouldn't therefore the response of the Confucian tradition be still overly conservative, precisely because it is so concerned about revolutionary projects that it would lead you to, well, not undertake them, which is certainly the case. Now, 2 points I want to raise. The first historically is, going back to what I was saying earlier, absolutely the tradition has emphasized radical transformation. Again, it's built into it. Indeed, if you look historically, you could argue the Confucian tradition led to arguably the single most dramatic attempts to rework the socio-political world, arguably up until the emergence of capitalism. I'll get momentarily to how we should even think of that. But prior to the emergence of capitalism, I think you could argue that the Confucian tradition was the one most focused on trying to rework the entire world in terms of building bureaucracies, infrastructure, the entire forms of standardized testing, the entire attempts to build a meritocracy, the entire attempts to also build a meritocracy that would not be controlled by moneyed interests, which would allow it to focus on questions of how do you actually try to make the world flourish if you're not having a governmental structure overly controlled by moneyed interests and local aristocratic interests. So dramatic transformation. Now, it is also true that was more of a piecemeal approach. They did not try to do this in a generation. It is also true, you could say, well, it's not as dramatic as the radical transformations of capitalism. Arguably, that's true, but again, as I mentioned last week, we also have to deal with the fact, and statistically this is a fact, that if you look at, just to stick with our current example, America, I mean, we have a level of economic and social disparity that isn't much better than what we often will look back to as the prototypical bad example of an aristocratic society, say 18th century France. We're not much better. If you look at social mobility, we're not much better. There was almost no social mobility in 18th century France. There's not a lot more. We tend to clothe all of this with our great rhetoric of freedom, disruption, innovation. It's a great rhetoric. I think we need to realize the world we are currently living in is hardly living up to those goals. Now, that, of course, in itself isn't a critique of the first project, because the argument there would be, we need to live up to them. But I think one of the challenges we would get from Confucianism would be to say, if the driver of the radical change is going to be in terms of the radical individual being freed from constraints, are you not by definition going to fall into exactly the problems we have seen over the past 2 centuries? Because by definition, aren't you going to end up focusing on the freedom of the great heroic individuals at the expense of the vast majority of the rest of the population throughout the world? And the argument from the Confucian perspective is, isn't that inherent in the first project? The very concerns we raised as early as Nietzsche, is there not an inherent danger if that is where you're locating freedom, the radical heroic individual, the infinity of the self, as opposed to structure, even in its reconstructed form, you're still not going to be highlighting what from the Confucian tradition would be one of the key issues, which is, no, you're not going to change the world unless you're changing all of the relationships throughout the social and even natural worlds, and that will never be accomplished by freeing a select few individuals. And therefore, you're going to have to be concerned with meritocracy, mobility, things that you can do at all levels, mundane and institutional, to try to drive that level of movement. Now, is this conservative? Well, it's focused on the longer term, without any question, I think we honestly have to admit that the grand revolutionary projects of the past 2 centuries have also come with incredible dangers. And from this perspective, I think there's a significant critique that we would have to take very seriously as to why it has fallen into those dangers. Now, with that being said, let us indeed also pose the next question, which is, well, are there issues we would need to reconstruct in the Confucian tradition as well, very much as we've been trying to do with the first project, highlighting issues like the ones I just mentioned, the tendency in the first project to focus on the radical, heroic individual, and we discussed attempts that can be made to reconstruct that tradition. From the Confucian perspective, that would be seen as inadequate, but let's pose the same question to the Confucian tradition. And again, let's return to this issue of conservatism. If there is, and I think there is, a powerful critique coming from the Confucian tradition about the revolutionary projects coming from the first tradition, these grand isms to radically transform the world, are there ways, however, that we could say, historically, the attempts to build meritocratic societies have also not led to the kind of tremendous levels of flourishing that we need them to. I think they've created, compared to what they were working against, namely the aristocratic societies, a lot like 18th century France, in their case, the ones that had dominated Eurasia during the Bronze Age, dramatic social transformation. Were they adequate? The answer is no. They were not focused on, they were focused very much on mass public infrastructure. They were not focused on mass education programs. They were not trying to create a system where, say, a peasant in the fields would have an honest chance of gaining the kind of training and cultivation that would allow them, say, to gain a bureaucratic position. So could we now think of how we could reconstruct these focuses without falling into the dangers that the tradition, I would say correctly, notes with the tendency to try to create a totalizing ism? I think the answer is yes. So could we, for example, taking their view of history seriously, history is accumulative, right? Practices develop. Once those practices develop, the goal is how do you rework them and how do you alter them and change them? In the case at hand, we now have a world that has, relatively speaking, developed incredibly powerful visions of, let's again turn to America, how to build mass education systems. I also think we have to admit, and we've noted this from our very first class here, education in America is failing in its goals. It's failing in its goals to create the meritocratic social mobility it claims to create. I think it's clearly failing. It is clearly failing in its goals of how to actually have an educational process that would help humans to break out of their patterns and really truly grow. But institutionally, the fact that we have created such incredibly strong educational systems where you're now getting mass education, so everyone at least has an option of going through schools of at least K through 12, that's extraordinary. Can we build on that to then say, but let's rethink how the K through 12 educational system works? Let's rethink how the next stages, college and even professional schools, operate. And could we do this in a way that would be aimed at these goals of training people to break patterns, begin to sense the world around them, training them to actually begin to become the kind of, from this perspective, extraordinary humans that they are capable of becoming? Could we, in other words, build on these great institutional developments and rework them from a Confucian perspective of what development would mean? What would be the result? Well, and again, I'll just close here with the return to the point of conservatism. We don't know. But that's why ultimately it would not be conservative. The goal of this is precisely as the goal, as we saw in the early tradition, was you are trying to create a world where people are being broken from these patterns, put on this transformative process, creating an institutional structure that will both encourage that and then allow those who are successfully doing so to be in positions of power. Then you intentionally don't say, and what will they do? What you intentionally say is, you are then going to try to create a world where we could flourish. How? In all of the problems we are facing, would you do it? They won't answer. But the themes would be clear. They would be deeply concerned with the fact in America that you have such radical economic disparity. That, from this perspective, is unacceptable. They would be deeply concerned with the fact that you have almost no social mobility, despite the wording that we like to use to claim that this is what defines America. They would be very concerned about that. And they would say, how would we begin to create a world where that would happen? And where we would even have a style of life on even a daily basis that would not be so inherently destructive on so much of the world's population, that would not be so inherently destructive on the larger natural world, because they would correctly say, the natural world as we perceive it, what we call the natural world, is again a product of our domestication, and we are destroying it, and therefore will destroy ourselves in the process. That too would be an issue they would be deeply concerned with in terms of how would you actually create a world where everything could flourish. So in the end, I would say I do think this vision has a very, very powerful possibility both to challenge our assumptions about how to achieve human freedom, even individual freedom, even that those words would be very much challenged in this tradition. And I think a vision very concrete and practical, since this is the focus of the tradition, of what that would even mean in terms of, say, an educational process. And certainly if you're looking at America, that would be an extraordinary place to begin the kind of work that this tradition would emphasize so strongly.
Very good. So let me begin first by clarifying my interpretation of Confucianism in two respects, because I think there's some misunderstanding there of what my view is. So the first issue regards the first of the four elements that I attributed to Confucianism, which is what I call the anti-metaphysical metaphysics.
Yes.
Of course, the Confucianist idea is that we reconstruct the world. But we reconstruct our world, the world of society, and nature insofar as we impinge on nature. But we're surrounded by this great darkness of the natural cosmos, which is not built on our logic, yes, and which has no intimate continuity with our concerns.
Yes.
It's indifferent to us.
Yes.
And so the character of this project is the character of a self-grounding of humanity. And although that may seem obvious to the secular mind today, it was not the characteristic of the other major metaphysical and spiritual projects in the world. The Semitic monotheisms present us with a narrative of the relation between God and humanity that is then the grounding of what we are to do in our own lives, both individually and socially. The speculative monism of ancient India that philosophers like Schopenhauer continued does the same thing. That is, it attempts to infer the light, the direction, from a general view of the framework. This is very different, because here the idea is we don't know what the framework is, or the framework is fundamentally alien to our humanity, to our concerns, and in a meaningless world, we can construct meaning. That's what I meant by the anti-metaphysical metaphysic, and it seems to me to be an essential feature of this view. Now, then the second clarification that I want to make is this. I never actually said that Confucianism is intrinsically conservative. I said something else, which is that there is in this view an unresolved ambiguity about its relation to its social template, to its social content. That's the point. That is, To what extent is this conception of human life and of its ennoblement and improvement to be achieved through a spiritualization of existing society or through a radical transformation of it? And the truth is that that's unresolved, because and it's unresolved in a way that is parallel to the lack of resolution of the same issue in the historical evolution of, for example, of Christianity. So the Christian view has, one might think, political implications. But what are they? They've always been in dispute. So in its actual historical evolution, Christianity, especially organized Christianity and the doctrinal corpus, has established a series of compromises with a series of social regimes. Feudalism, the feudal ethic of chivalry, or the 19th century Victorian ethic of family propriety. What are they? They are some kind of compromise of a Christian moral vision with the contingent arrangements and beliefs of a particular society. On the other hand, from time to time, Christianity has been interpreted as requiring a revolutionary transformation of society. So this has been an unresolved issue in the evolution of Christianity. And my simple claim is that it's also unresolved in this view. Now, what happens when an issue like that is unresolved? What happens is what we see in the evolution of Christianity, that if the issue is not resolved, in historical practice, the tendency will be for the impulse of spiritualization or humanization to prevail over the impulse of reconstruction. That's what's always happened. And so on that view, as the Marxists would say, it's not an accident that the recurrent view among the Chinese Marxists has been every reactionary in Chinese history has appealed to Confucianism. And that's been the view of the revolutionaries. And the more leftist you are in that tradition, the more likely you are to be an opponent of Confucianism and to deride it. Although if you take a right-wing view of Marxism, then you'll be more sympathetic to Confucianism. Now, have all these people been mistaken? No, I think it's been because of the implications of this unresolved ambiguity. And so now, in relation to the question, to the way this appears in the other project that we explored, the project of nonconformity and self-invention, there's a variant of it, the Nietzschean Emersonian variant, that has as its residual politics the idea of the strong, heroic agent standing above the herd. And that's what happens by default if there is no other political project. And thus, in our discussion of that project, the idea that one of its flaws, one of the crucial contestable points, is the absence of a political vision, and the danger that in the absence of a developed political vision, of the institutional form of a shared empowerment, an enhancement of agency that is shared rather than achieved just individually, what will prevail is this idea of the strong individual above the herd, which is a perversion. That was the criticism at that point. Now then, in the light of these two clarifications, I then simply restate my view of what seemed to me to be the 3 points that are most contestable from the perspective of a mind that has been formed in the other tradition, in the tradition of the project of nonconformity and self-invention. And I say from the perspective because in this worldwide historical struggle, there's no Archimedean position. There's no position that is somehow neutral. There's this contest of visions of who we are and who we can and should become. And the way we acquire greater insight is by, as you said, comparing them, contrasting them, trying to gain distance from them, but not appealing to the false idea that there's some neutral space which is somehow equidistant from them, because that doesn't exist. Now, from the standpoint of that effort, then, it seems to me that there are three large areas of contest. So the first area of contest has to do with the understanding of the self, of who we are, of what are the most defining attributes of our humanity. And it does seem that in the Confucianist view, there is what I would call a finitistic or naturalistic view of our humanity. By contrast to the view that we could associate with the idea of infinity. So the other view is the view that there's always more in us than there is in the social and cultural worlds that we build and inhabit. They are finite in relation to us, and we are infinite in relation to them. And this infinite character, this attribute of irrepressible transcendence, will, according to that view, color our relation to all the other people, the relation of the self to the others, and the relation of the self to the world. So, for example, one of the implications in the relation to other people will be that everything that we receive from the others will seem to us like a down payment on a transaction that can never be completed. And it will have this unfinished and tormenting character. And the implication for our relation to a particular world is that no world deserves to satisfy us. Some can be better than others, and some can, and one of the ways in which some can be better than others is that some can, to a greater extent, allow us to engage in them without surrendering to them, without giving them the last word. So we continue inside of them to resist them. Another implication is that there is no role that is worthy of a human being. There's no particular social role. The consequence is that we have to perform every social role ambivalently. This is Jean-Paul Sartre's famous description of bad faith in the performance of a role. So on that view, this bad faith in which we perform a role but don't really believe in it, rather than being some kind of failure, is an expression of our humanity. That's a different view of who we are. And the question is, which of these views is most true? Now, I have to say that the conception of the self that is represented today in evolutionary psychology and cognitive psychology is much, much closer to this Confucianist view than it is to the view of the infinite. So if you ask, what are the teachings of, quote, science in this contest, the answer is science intervenes on the side of Confucianism in favor of a naturalistic view. Does it mean that it's right? I don't think so, but that's the beginning of a long controversy. So this is the first large area of dispute. Now, the second area of dispute is this question of the relation to the social template, the social context. It's not the idea of a conservative bias. It's the idea of an unresolved relation to the particular social context in which and that is then what is unsatisfactory on this view from this other perspective, that there's a suspended animation. So meritocracy, well, is meritocracy an adequate change? Or is it just the beginning of a new set of problems? And do we have to have an institutional program that changes the economy and the political order to achieve the shared bigness? And what's the direction? Now, I think we should get rid of the idea that it's just one big revolutionary change, because that's a kind of red herring. That's a legacy of the history of Marxism and classical European social theory, that a fundamental change is somehow a big systemic substitution, because classical European social theory had this idea that there's a closed list of regimes, and you either manage a regime, like capitalism, or you substitute it by another indivisible regime. So it's this binary view of politics. Politics is either reformist or revolutionary. And it's just a mistake, because structural change is always fragmentary to some extent or another, but can nevertheless, over time, become radical in its outcome, despite being gradual or cumulative in its method. That's what real structural change is like. And so not on the unreconstructed version of the other view, as we have it, for example, in Nietzsche or in Emerson, but on a suitably reconstructed view, the political project, conceived of not as a blueprint, but as a direction, is essential. And we can't tolerate this unresolved ambiguity of the relation of the project to its social template. Now comes the third area of dispute. And the third area of dispute has to do with the relation of the project to what I've been calling these incurable flaws in the human condition. And what are they? Our mortality, that we will die, our groundlessness, that we're unable to discern the framework or the basis of our existence, and our insatiability, that we're just surrounded by the finite, by the limited, but from the limited, we want the unlimited. And so there's this tormented quality of our experience. Now, one view, and it is a view that seems to have prevailed in this Confucianist tradition and to have been approved by many Western philosophers, is that we should turn decisively away from these incurable flaws in human condition to what we can master and what we can engage in, our space, this human clearing in the midst of the darkness. And not allow us to be terrified, to be terrorized by these incurable flaws. Now, that's what's in dispute, because the opposing view, and the view that in these arguments I, for example, would defend, is that we shouldn't turn away from them. And that confronting them, not just from time to time, but persistently, is an essential element in our path, both individually and collectively. First, because it's the truth. And we don't want lullabies if we want to develop ourselves individually and collectively. Second, because it's the antidote to Prometheanism or triumphalism. But third, and most significantly, because this confrontation with the incurable flaws in the human condition is what awakens us. And not just once, but at every moment. It's what awakens us from the slumber, from the stupor, from the stupefaction in which we squander our supreme resource, life, right now, with its characteristic qualities of surfeit, spontaneity, and surprise. That we need to terrorize ourselves in this way, to awaken to life and to possess it with its dramatic and unilinear quality. And it's a different moral vision from the this worldliness. And now, imagine how hard it is to argue about this. Should we confront these flaws? Should we turn away from them? But it's not that we can't argue about them. It's that the argument is inconclusive. That's the issue. And it's not that we can't make better or worse arguments. But this is the other large area of contestation. Now, then, just to remind you about my argument, which is exactly parallel to the kind of argument that I tried to have about the other project. As in the other project, I identified flaws, and the issue is, can we reconstruct it? Imagine it reconstructed in some way to address these flaws. Your version just now didn't seem to me to do that, because you weren't admitting that these were areas of dispute. But for me, taking these as the areas of dispute, what I want is to see if there's a version of this project that can address these three areas. And so it's a more ambitious reconstruction of this tradition. We don't have it yet, but that would be a great project in the world. And now then the question is then with which the next to the last step at the end of the last class. Imagine that each of these two projects that we've been discussing were reconstructed in that spirit to address their respective flaws, their frailties, the areas in which they are most contestable. What would be the result? Would they converge? Would there then be a synthesis? And the claim I made is that even then, there wouldn't be a synthesis. The dispute would remain, but it would be a dispute at a higher level, because it wouldn't be a dispute between the relatively primitive versions of these two projects, which are the versions that history has given us. It would be a dispute between these superior versions. And even then, and we don't have that dispute yet, because we don't have the reconstructed versions of those two projects. But even then, if we had the reconstructed versions, there would be still an abyss between these two projects in their reconstructed versions. And I tried to describe that abyss, to map it, so some of its elements. So the first point of difference that would remain has to do with the point of departure. So for the other project, even in its reconstructed form, the point of departure is still the self, encased in the dying organism, radically separated from the others. In the reconstructed version of this project, the point of departure is the dyad. It's the interpersonal. That's the point of departure. The interpersonal is the beginning, not the self, and what the cognitive psychologists call joint intentionality. Now, the second difference that would remain would have to do with this idea of who we are. The finitistic view versus the infinite view, with the implications that I invoked before. The third point of difference that would remain would be the relation of these two reconstructed projects to this revolutionary agenda of the last 200 years in the world. Set the world on fire. Liberalism, socialism, democracy, that's the political side. Romanticism, that's the personalist side. Set the world on fire. Now we're in this counter-revolutionary interlude. Some people like me want the revolution to continue and say we won't allow our views to be controlled by the biases of the counter-revolutionary interlude. But to do that, we have to reinvent this project. Now, there's a difference between, in the relation of these two agendas in their reconstructed form to this project, this revolutionary agenda. The reconstructed form of the Confucianist tradition would not necessarily be antagonistic to the revolutionary agenda. It might be or might not be. And it would try and pick and choose in the way you just did in your remarks. Revolution is dangerous. It may not crack up to be what we think it is, and so forth. The other reconstructed view cannot ever escape its intimate, indissoluble connection with this revolutionary agenda. It co-evolved with this revolutionary agenda. It's inseparable from it. It's one of its faces. Now, then the fourth element which would remain of difference between these two is the attitude to disruption and to disruptors. And I think this is very interesting and very revealing. So I think I cited in an earlier class this remark of the Spanish philosopher Unamuno, speaking from within this tradition of the project of self-invention and nonconformity. He says, in the world, the victorious, the winners, are those who adapt to the world. The losers are those who demand that the world adapt to them. And then he concludes, and therefore, the advance of humanity rests squarely on the shoulders of the losers. And he concludes, and Christianity is the religion of the losers, not the religion of the resentful. That's the idea. So the human race has a spiritual aristocracy. The spiritual aristocracy of the human race are the disruptors, the troublemakers, the ones who look for trouble instead of trying to keep out of trouble. And everyone else in the world and in history suspects that all this disruption business is concealing a large doses of self-aggrandizement and self-deception. And that's a difference that remains in humanity. Should we all become disruptors? And even in the reconstructed version, and I don't think there's any papering over of Confucianism or any reconstruction of it that will ever plausibly make it look like a gospel of permanent disruption. But that's what this other tradition is at its heart. And so that's a contest that remains. So the object here, look, from my standpoint, the object, it's not like in this course we're trying to work towards a report card. we're the tribunal, we're sitting in judgment on these spiritual visions in world history. This one is good, that one is bad, this gets an A, that gets a B. That's ridiculous. This is about us, about our moral confusions. And there isn't this neutral space. And the question is, we can't overcome these conflicts, these spiritual conflicts, and find this neutral space or this synthesis. But what we can do is try to lead the conflict to a higher level so that both the positions or the other positions all become stronger. Our interest is to make them stronger. And so that the conflict will be represented in the spiritual experience of humanity in its strongest and therefore its most fertile form. So that's what I wanted to say.
So I will be brief in my response because I do want to open this up, but and I think the differences are clear, so I can be brief. Just very briefly, again, I would say in response to your final points, the key for doing that, in fact, the key for even having a class like this, is precisely that we try to allow these positions to question our most fundamental assumptions. And the reason I begin this way is, again, I will be brief, the differences are clear. With each of the points you've raised, I don't think Confucianism has a naturalistic vision of the self. I think one of the key opening moves throughout the tradition is to say, assume everything we ascribe to nature, both human nature, the world outside of us socially, as well as what we call the actual natural world, is a human construction and probably a very poor and dangerous one. So evolutionary psychologists would not at all agree, and vice versa, with the Confucian view of the self. The entire issue of the social template, crucial in Confucianism, but again, I worry you're wording this as the key point for them, which is all about, same point, assume the social template we're born into, which we tend to assume is natural, is on the contrary an historical construct that has dangers we tend not to even see because we naturalize it, and the whole push of the tradition is to work against it. Now, you were right, the part of the push of that is not claiming the infinity of the self, you're absolutely right, but part of the excitement of, at least in my opinion, taking this tradition seriously is it would claim that vision of the infinite self, ironically in the way it can play out, both philosophically and historically, can lead to a failure to deal with a kind of transformative push that the Confucian tradition cares about, because they would say there's always a danger you will fall into a view that these things that are currently me are part of my infinitely true, authentic self. And the push of the Confucian tradition, again, is consistently, no, assume they're probably they're patterns and customs you've fallen into that are potentially very dangerous. And even the opening point you made, too, directly related, you correctly pointed out that it is absolutely true. So Mao Zedong would always say, well, people who were against my revolution, like Lin Biao, are Confucians. So that's right. He would call on call on people who opposed him as being Confucians. But I mean, that's an historical moment. I mean, right now, of course, precisely because of U.S. forms of neoliberal policies being pursued, China too has gotten an unbelievable disparity between wealthy and poor. There's a self-conscious sense that governance structures have also become dysfunctional because they've been overly controlled by corporate interests. And in response to this, there is a self-proclaimed new left movement that turns to, among other things, Confucianism, which is all about how do we create this divorce between governance structures and moneyed interests? How would we recreate a governance structure that would be supportive of a larger body of the population rather than moneyed interests? And these sort of self-proclaimed new left who are turning to Confucianism, which is not surprising. I mean, you can take these ideas in different directions, and the same is, of course, true of Christianity. Most 19th century revolutionary thinkers explicitly called what they were reacting against Christianity. They were calling for a secular vision as opposed to Christianity. We equally know you can have and have had leftist movements also self-proclaimed Christian. So again, it's just, I worry your framing of this, the examples you choose and your terms in terms of the philosophical difference tend to emphasize sort of an acceptance of the world in Confucianism that doesn't provide the drive that you're talking about. And I think the key difference rather is the drive for change and the values that underlie that change, and even a vision of what change is, are indeed radically different. And that should be the real focus of the concern between them and the debate between them.
Well, why don't we
Yeah,
open
let's
it
throw
up?
this out. Yes. Yes, please.
So I'm very, in particular, I'm very sort of taken by the discussion about Confucian. And I really appreciate your framing the Confucian project so lucidly. And I wanted, and I agree with it for the most part, I wanted to tease out some of the strands, particularly self,
Yes.
because I think it addresses some of Professor Elmer's questions. So in the Confucian tradition, there are the four basic principles of benevolence, righteousness, ritual, and wisdom. And benevolence, if you look at the Analects text, is the most commonly referred to. It is the one virtue that's brought up. If you count the number of times it's mentioned, it's the primary.
Absolutely.
And so benevolence is a character made up of one part human, the other part is two. Benevolence cannot happen unless you have two people at least. So it doesn't happen by yourself. And it is the primary virtue. And because you want to realize benevolence, you engage in the virtue of righteousness, just understanding what is right and wrong, so that you can understand the source from which you are to move forward, and to practice and to sense and to gain experience and knowledge, you acquire a larger consciousness of the world around you and the community and society, and the, the spectrum of your actions in terms of expressing the four virtues is open. And that's why I agree with you about, even though you have still the structure of bureaucracy, what the bureaucrats do and act is still very open-ended. And so there's the Confucian project assumes the self is embedded. You cannot sort of just get out of the society. You're born into the society. You're born into a family. You're born into certain social status. You are embedded, but what you do with that is you're not. It is not expected that you just sort of stay in your stupor and go through the routine, but you are asked to break through the boundaries of the smaller consciousness to gain a greater consciousness of how to operate.
Yes, beautifully put. Yes, thank you. Beautifully put. Yes. Did you want to respond?
No, no. Let's hear voices.
Absolutely. Yes, please.
Question regarding the notion of musical confusion. Music.
Yes.
You mentioned like 2 weeks before the metaphor of jazz as a space where disruption,
Yes.
innovation, but also be respectful regarding the traditions.
Yes.
And it's interesting in a jazz concert, for
Yeah.
example, how I don't know, the saxophonist glances at the drummer and they communicate with
Yes.
with the eyes and glances and so on. So I was wondering if music could be like a metaphor to another way to put this to agendas to dialogue, because jazz is of course communal but also individual. There's a necessity of self-expression, of finding your own voice within a context in which you're also being part of a tradition. Um, and reading Confucius, I was struck by the many references to music, and also it reminded me that maybe Plato got it wrong when he said philosophy is the highest music. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe music is the highest philosophy. I don't know if you can talk about that.
Yeah, very beautifully put. And let me say, I think you're right. I mean, you certainly see this in the Analects, and when you read the entire tradition, it only underlines your point. Music is in many ways the single most significant analogy that they will go back to over and over again. And I think the reasons are the ones you mentioned. So first, in music in general, the whole working of music is based on taking a messy, random set of sounds out there and weaving them, and it's an active work of weaving where you're trying to actually alter these relationships. And needless to say, for a listener and a performer, it's all about our complex emotions being worked through, these complex harmonies being formed, and getting to the heart of your point, in the act of performance, this is absolutely true as well. So another example they will use constantly is, say, think of the act of training and cultivation, as the earlier statement was making, as the equivalent of learning music, right? At first, it's unbelievably difficult training. So you're learning a piano with just years and years of incredibly rigorous training. But the goal of that rigorous training is not to become an automaton. I mean, the goal of that rigorous training is to train you to sense the music, sense the mood of a room, sense how to play in a way that will alter the mood of a room, and think of that as the self-cultivation process. And then finally, getting to your excellent point about jazz, I agree. I think jazz can be an excellent analogy for both, but in very different ways. So from the Confucian perspective, think of jazz as, exactly as you said, it involves an incredibly amount of the rigorous training that we just mentioned. Then in the act of performance, it's all based upon, when it's working, an incredibly powerful sensing of what all of the other figures are doing with their instruments, how that is and is not affecting the larger audience, and you're constantly trying to weave what you're doing in working with all of that. It's all about improvisation, but all about improvisation in terms of connecting and sensing, working with the other players, working with the audience, and constant alteration and change, so you're not following a pre-given script, and yet it's also not anything goes. It's all based upon sensing and connecting. And I think that analogy works incredibly well from the Confucian tradition. Now, to shift the analogy slightly, there's another form of jazz that will do what I just mentioned, but the focus will often be on sort of each figure at the moment when the other players kind of pull back and are simply doing the rhythms, and each player doing the dramatic improvisation to sort of show their incredible creativity. From the Confucian perspective, that would be overly focused on, oh, look at me, look at how amazingly I can play this saxophone for the next 3 minutes before I fade back and let the drummer show how amazingly the drummer can drum. The Confucian perspective would say, no, 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 really focus on these connections. Focus on that constant work, and again, sticking to your larger point, which is, I think, beautiful, think of our social worlds that way. Think of it in terms of music in all of these different senses. So yeah, beautifully put, and I think you're absolutely right. This is one of the central metaphors they will constantly come back to. Yes, please.
In terms of practically trying to allow these positions to really challenge
Yes.
fundamental beliefs, which is
Yeah.
partially what we're trying to do.
Yes.
There's one thing to be exposed to something different,
Yeah.
just for the sake, oh, that's cool, that's a different viewpoint. What should our process be in which to evaluate and think about? Like, should we compare that to our experience? Should we go through our rationality, which is in of itself a question? And where do we draw the line between
Yeah.
choice and assumption versus, like,
Yeah.
in light of our groundlessness of actually saying, well, no, this is why I believe.
This is the argument we had in the very first class, right? This idea that we're dealing here with the most comprehensive ideas, and ideas that ground an existential imperative in a view of ourselves and of our situation in the world, that undermine the simple distinction between the is and the ought, and that have this quality that they can be argued, and they should be argued, but the arguments are inconclusive. And that's just the situation. And so there's a confusion about relativism, because it's not just a, now what is the character of the arguments is one question implicit in your comment. There are different kinds of arguments. So, for example, one kind of argument is the appeal to experience. Each of these visions is, among other things, a promise of happiness. It says, and each is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It says, act as if I were true, and you will make me true. But will the promise be kept? That is, if you act on that view, will what happens to you and to the world be what was promised or something else? So will the view somehow undermine itself in some way that will cast light on its limitations? That's an example of a kind of argument. So the compatibility of the assumptions of the view with what we know to be the case about ourselves or about the world, and so forth. So we begin to argue, we develop these arguments. And like the argument we were just having about Confucianism now, which is an argument in historical context, in which we're not just judging the abstractions, we're trying to understand what they really mean in their historical setting. By their fruits you will know them. And so what happens? What happens is that we can hope for a richer and richer set of discriminating arguments and criteria. But at the end of the day, the argument will still be inconclusive, and which is completely different from the picture presented to us by simple relativism or skepticism, which says you can't argue. So there's this gap, this cognitive gap between the arguments that we make in favor of these projects and the moment of commitment. Because then we're in, apparently, if you follow this, the moral and epistemological implications of this view, the situation is the following. We have these views about the only question that we cannot escape. What is the only question that we cannot escape? What will I do with my life? And how will I live? We can't escape that question because we're going to answer that question one way or the other, whether or not we have explicit ideas about it. And then on this view, we can make arguments about that, for and against these views, and in favor of their revision in a particular direction. But the arguments will peter out. There'll be a disproportion between the weight of the commitment and the adequacy of the arguments. The arguments will never be proportionate to the fateful character of the choice. That's the picture of this idea of the cognitive gap. So I'm making that claim about that situation. That's a contentious claim. That's not the only view one could have about the situation. But that's the view that I'm pressing in answer to your question.
And let me also add an answer, going back very much to the point of when we ask, do these arguments fit our experience of ourselves in the world? Of course, part of what's intriguing about the Confucian tradition is it would raise the question, which is a question for us, is our experience of the world accurate? Or is our experience of the world simply practices, patterns, customs we've fallen into that perhaps ought to be changed? And that isn't just at the level of argument, because they will say that is all about practice. And so one way to deal with these is think of your daily life. Again, this would be from the Confucian perspective, which at the moment in America, we tend to think of in terms of a self that we're always trying to find. In other words, there's some self there that I'm trying to look within, find what is good for myself, what will lead myself to be happy and fulfilled in terms of career, decisions, etc. Even when we think of career, partners, etc., we use terms like decision, choice. It's what is the best choice for this self, and what are the bases for making a good choice about what is good for this self. Now, note the Confucian tradition would reject all of those. Not all of those in the sense of saying they're wrong. It would say all of that is a construct, a world that we have built, which may have certain great implications, but also, and they would say by definition, assume very dangerous implications that we don't see. So they would say, put in practice alternate ways of doing things. And very practically, they would say, this is very doable from a Confucian perspective, they would say, actively begin to think, okay, what if they're onto something? I just am this kind of messy bunch of stuff. Your translation before of stuff, I think is a very good translation. We've got a messy bunch of stuff. That messy bunch of stuff has fallen into certain patterns. I call this now my true self, but don't. So go for like a few days or a few weeks where you don't call this your true self. You're not thinking, okay, I'm going through the day making decisions. What if you're really not? That you're going through the day just being affected by things around you, and your response to things around you are based on these patterns that you have fallen into from potentially, from this perspective, extremely young age. And then, if you're assuming all of that, and this is the key point, you actively begin to alter those, right? So you actively begin to alter little things you do, so sort of how you're perceiving things, how you're interacting with those around you, basic things like your basic routines, you begin to alter them. As you alter those routines and alter those ways of interacting with those around you, even tiny little differences, you immediately note the surprisingly huge repercussions they start having. Going back to my earlier example, this person's nice, this person has a bad temper. Literally within 2 days, you will see that's not really true. Like you're doing little things that are bringing out certain elements of people, because we're all pattern creatures. Begin to alter that, it begins to shift. And literally within a handful of days, this is a pretty minimal level of training, you begin to see what they're talking about. Like you begin to see, oh, I start feeling radically different about what I was previously calling my true self. Relationships begin to alter, minimally at first, but within a few days, and certainly a few weeks, surprisingly largely. And then just imagine you started really doing this every day for the rest of your life. And it's pretty easy to glimpse what they're talking about. I mean, you would, over the course of a life, you would transform yourself into being a very different person, far more responsive to the world, far better at sensing the world around you and working to help those around you. You would be incomparably better, because again, you'll sense this in, I promise, 2 to 3 days, incomparably better at seeing those around you as these messy selves that you can work with and alter your relationship with, and get into the larger socio-political economic issues, you begin to think of those in different ways. So here it isn't even a question of how do we reconcile these different arguments. Part of what you're also trying to do is, in our experience, are they onto something? And I think the easy answer would be, in both cases, yes, but how very differently do you end up living your life when you start putting them into practice?
So this will actually be
Yes.
the main topic of our last class.
Indeed, absolutely.
We only have 2 left after this.
Indeed.
So maybe we should begin with the discussion of Buddhism.
Let's do indeed. Indeed.
Please.
Absolutely. So let us turn to Buddhism. There's still several questions up. Don't worry, because these are ongoing discussions. So once we turn to Buddhism, the issues of Confucianism and the first project will come in. And then, as Roberta mentioned, our final class will be all about disputing and thinking through the implications of these differences. So apologies for those with hands up, but you'll have plenty of time to ask. So let us now turn to the third of the 3 major projects that we'll be exploring. Our apologies that the semester is short. It would be wonderful if we had more time, but nonetheless, even 3 is
So
very
Michael, let
powerful.
me just interrupt and comment on that statement which you just made. So just so you understand the architecture of our agenda here in the course, the main focus is on this contest between these 2 projects, their current form, their possible revised form. But now we remind ourselves that these 2 that have been our main focus are far from exhausting the moral and spiritual agenda of humanity. And if we think of another view that is somehow orthogonal to this contest, this is perhaps the single most striking one, because it departs from radically different assumptions and has radically different implications. So that's the idea here, that there's this conversation that we imagine between these 2 projects, and the conversation is interrupted by a knock on the door and says, I've been left out, and I have the real truth. So, and that's what we're going to hear about.
So here's the knock on the door. So let us begin. Oh, sorry, I'm messing myself up, which would mean I'm losing the microphone. Okay. So let us begin with ideas that have become very common nowadays that we therefore tend to assume as being almost prototypically modern and Western. They are not, actually. These have been ideas that have been around for a long time that, as we've already seen, Confucianism knew about and opposed, but Buddhism, as Roberto was mentioning, will oppose it in stronger and certainly very, very different ways. So,
And you're taking it as also represented in the history of Western philosophy by one of the most remarkable philosophers of all time, Schopenhauer.
Very much so, which I might add underlines a key point that we've been emphasizing throughout the course. Don't think of these as different sets of cultural assumptions that are therefore by some level, to some degree, incommensurable. So you have Western, Chinese, Indian, not at all. All of these have had incredible impacts. So Buddhism will fundamentally impact China. Getting back to Roberto's example, one of the key figures in the Buddhist tradition is actually Schopenhauer, obviously a European 19th century thinker. So these ideas are not restricted to certain cultures. They are not incommensurable. These ideas can be listened to and built upon anywhere, and very much including the present day moment. So, you have a self, and you have a self that is within, deep within, that you want to look for and find. And once you find it, you want to live life on your terms. You want to live life, and this is a key term that will pop up in world philosophy, certainly very much in the present day, according to your will, right? Because the world, you quickly realize, is not really set up for you and what would be best for you. And so part of what you want to do is use your will to whatever extent, perhaps, impose your will on the world to make the world be the sort of place that would be good for you, and even to the extent where you can't literally go so far as to impose your will on the world, at the minimum, your will should allow you to control those things you can control. You can control yourself. You can control significant things about yourself. You can make decisions about how best to live your life that will allow you to flourish. So, giving early examples, you can choose your career, you can choose things around you, you can at a very much more mundane level, choose things to buy, you can choose a partner, all of which are exercises of the will to allow you to live your life successfully. And again, at a larger level, perhaps you will even be in a position, if you happen to be born into a position of power or attain power, to impose your will on a much larger level too. The will, in other words, is the path to liberation because it allows us to exercise freedom in the world, particularly freedom for the self. Right? What if that is horrifically wrong? What if, in fact, what we define as the will is, in fact, simply playing out our desires at the most base, ridiculous level? The base, ridiculous level of a self that is, as the Confucians would say, untrained, but we'll see the Buddhists will go much further than this, but we'll put off how far for a moment, but our base desires. What if, in other words, the world that we are thinking we are creating through our will is basically what Fourier was talking about, the figure we read several weeks ago, that's all about how we could actually create a world in which all of our desires could simply be fulfilled. So you don't train yourself, you don't alter yourself, as a Confucian would say, you simply have a bunch of desires and you try to fulfill them. What if, in fact, that's actually how we are living our life when we think we are making decisions with our will and creating a world for ourselves? We are simply playing out our desires. And what if, as well, those desires are simply attempts, by definition from this perspective, doomed attempts, to find a place of permanence for ourselves in this endless world of flux. So when I think, okay, I will buy this and it will make me happy, that one's a pretty easy example to see. It's simply playing out our desires. But what we're really doing is foolishly thinking we can achieve our desires and fulfill our desires from these immediate attachments to immediate things. And what if that's not a mundane example? What if that's our lives? What if we're doing the same thing when we choose a partner? Oh, I choose a partner because with my will, I will see this is a person who either is like me or will work well with me. I am trying to create a world of permanence and attachment by attaching my things to things I claim to be permanent, when in fact, I and this person and the entire world are in a constant state of flux. What if, in fact, my entire vision, not only of myself, but of the world and of every human being, is based upon this false attempt to create a world of stable selves, stable things that I can possess, control, act within, all of which are simply playing out my base desires for permanence, basic attachments that will lead to my fulfillment? What if underlying all of our activities, all of our attempts to gain things, to gain fame, to be successful, are simply doomed attempts to play out our worst desires, to find permanent things that we can become attached to that will allow our fulfillment? If I gain all of these things, I will be wealthy, I will be powerful, I will have lots of material things, I'll have the perfect partner, I will have the perfect career, and I am dooming myself to misery, and as we'll see momentarily, at least as importantly, dooming everyone else around me to misery by these projects that I'm imposing on the world, because all are an attempt to find, through these attachments, permanence in a world of flux. Now, some of this, again, is easy to understand, right? If I'm trying to buy a TV, like, so we don't buy TVs, we're trying to buy a computer that will make me really happy, then that's clear. Okay, yeah, fine, it's a permanent thing. And we know, of course, that they fall apart, but let's ramp this up. Suppose this is true for everything that we create through our will. When I say everything, they mean not just our failed and doomed attempts to create the obvious world of permanence around us that is doomed. They mean everything. What if our entire vision of a self is the same thing? What if our entire vision that I have, this self, that is there, pre-given, that I am using my will to fulfill and make happy and be successful in the world, what if that very self is a creation of the exact same things I am talking about, our base desires for permanence? In a world of endless flux that includes what I mistakenly call myself, what if, on the contrary, through my will and all the things we have been mentioning, I am creating this self, which even means this thing I think I have, or that I think I am, is itself simply a product of our desires. And if all of our desires for permanence, all of our attempts to become attached to these things that will allow our fulfillment, if all of them are doomed, it's equally true of this thing I call the self. What if all of this is a doomed attempt to create permanence in a world of flux? What if, in other words, our entire way of being in the world, including what we mistakenly call ourselves, is a product of these endless attempts to find permanence? If this is the case, note, it would mean basically pretty much everything we tend, especially in modern day America, to spend our lives trying to do, taking for granted it will lead to our fulfillment, is dooming us. And note as well, we are also dooming everything else around us too. It's not just that I am going to be utterly unfulfilled in all of these attempts at creating a self with a will that will be imposed and gain fulfillment in action. It also means I'm also creating endless suffering for everything else around me too. Because de facto, despite my claims that I am, with my will, connecting with people around me, I am basically treating other humans, in fact, all sentient beings, as the equivalent of buying that shiny, nice new thing that I think will make me happy. I render them into objects that are being created for myself. I'm creating a self that is doomed, I'm creating a world that is doomed, and I'm creating a world in which all sentient figures, all sentient creatures, humans and non-human alike, are doomed to suffer. That's the world we're creating. That is the world we are actively creating every single moment of our day when we do all of the things that we think we should be doing to lead to our personal fulfillment. Now, if this is the case, what is the solution? As you can see immediately, the first project from this perspective would not solve anything because it would lead to sort of growth, if anything, of all of the dangers by focusing on the dramatic liberation of the self and the dramatic liberation of the will, which from this perspective is precisely the problem. Even Confucianism, which shares some concerns, right? It certainly shares a concern that what we think of as the self is really a product of the patterns and customs we have fallen into. But note, the key with Confucianism is all about, therefore, breaking out of those to finally create relationships in which we could truly flourish. It is still operating within a world that, from the Buddhist perspective, is a creation of the will. And what would that world be that we have created? We've already noted it is a world of suffering, but it is also, and here, again, we'll note a difference even from Confucianism, it is an illusory world. Now, with this word, in the American context, when we hear the word illusory, we tend to think, oh, it's an illusion like a magician would give us. We have to see through it. Keep in mind, in the Buddhist tradition, when they say we have created a world of illusion, it is a world we really live in. Like, we have constructed this world. But think about the possibility that everything we think of as natural, the self, the social world, the natural world as we experience it, all of this, all of it, is an illusory world that we have constructed through our will, which again is simply, really, the playing out of our base desires. All of this is the case, needless to say. The goal is to break all of this, to break out of the world of the will, to break out of the world of the self, defined in this way, and to break out of this illusory world. If we could do this, if we could truly destroy, extinguish would be even a better translation, this sets of desires leading to our misunderstanding of the self and the will and the world that we have created, if we could do it, it would lead to a full extinguishing that would be the ultimate goal, nirvana. Nirvana would be a full extinguishing of all of these base desires that are leading to all of what I just mentioned. This is, as we will see, unbelievably difficult to accomplish. And to show how difficult this is, let me return to the world of suffering, which you might think I've painted in a rather bleak way. Actually, I've left out some of the really worst parts, so let's get to them now. So you might think, okay, if they are right, it would mean the world that we live in is, again, a product of our will, which is really our desires, a failed attempt to create a world of permanence that is doomed, a world in which we and all of those around us, all sentient beings, are doomed to endless suffering. You might think, well, that's pretty bleak, but at least at some point, the thing that the other two projects are concerned about, here might be a liberation. At least at some point we do die, so we get rid of the suffering. No, no. Because this self that we create through our will, it becomes, again, it's a twist on the term illusion that we need to take seriously. It does become a real thing. It's illusory, but it does exist. In fact, it exists in a strong sense. The world that we know is a product of all that I mentioned, including the self, which means when you die, you come back and suffer again and create endless suffering around you. And that will go on forever. You in a world of endless suffering, and you creating endless suffering for every single sentient being in the world. That is our life. And therefore, the stakes become a little higher. If all of this is the case, then not only do you need to stop doing this, needless to say, you understand what they mean by making the whole vision of nirvana so incredibly powerful. Because what nirvana would really mean is you would be able to either, were you to do so, choose to do so, act in this world of illusion in a way that would actually help those around you, care for those around you, instead of creating endless suffering, which is what we are otherwise doing. And it would also mean you and the self that you have created would no longer have to be in this endless cycle of rebirth, an endless creation of more suffering for those around you. When I say extinguishing, therefore, it can mean you will extinguish your desires and again act in the world in a way that will deepen care, or you could literally extinguish the self and no longer be a part of it. Since the latter, however, would mean that the world that we know of horrific suffering for all sentient beings would continue, those who have achieved what is called enlightenment often, luckily for us, choose to work in this world to help us. The Buddha himself, from this perspective, can be read one of two ways, and different aspects of the tradition will read him different ways. So the historical figure, who is, again, a rough contemporary of a Confucius on the one side, a Socrates on the other side, so part of this axial age period, that historical figure can be read in one of two ways that intriguingly doesn't really have a lot of implications in terms of which way you go, which is why the tradition can go both ways. So either that historical figure was a figure who did what I'm about to mention. He trained himself through an incredibly rigorous process to break himself of this world of desire, and then spent the rest of his life giving teachings to the rest of us to help us do the same. Or you can read him as having done this endless eons before, and he willingly chooses to return to help us. And that entire story that we are given of the Buddha as a human being going through this process in the 5th century BCE was actually done to help us see that we humans can, in fact, do this. And he could, in future iterations, and will, in future iterations, take different forms and do it in different ways to help us. Either way you read it, and it makes zero implications in terms of which way you read it, either way you read it, what he is teaching us is how to break out of this cycle of creating endless suffering for all sentient beings. How did he do it, whether we read him as the historical figure who did this in the 5th century BCE, or if we read him as a figure who's been coming back to help us and save us? Either way, how did he do it? Well, the way he did it is he grew up in a very powerful, wealthy family. He, in fact, was the son of a king and was going to therefore be a king himself, having all power, wealth given to him. And he realized that, in fact, in this world that he had been raised in of extraordinary luxury, he realized there was horrible suffering. Indeed, in many of the stories told about him, he, living in this world of luxury, didn't know the worlds of poverty and misery because they had built a world for him, and obviously this is meant to be analogically for the worlds we are building for ourselves, unintentionally, in which there was no suffering and no pain. And one time when he left the palace, he saw for the first time horrible poverty and horrible suffering. And all of his attendants were there, trained to say, oh, you don't see it, you don't see it, you don't see it. Of course, the analogy being, this is how we live our lives, right? Building around ourselves a world of seeming permanence, of seeming happiness where we are fulfilled, constantly training ourselves not to see the misery and suffering we are creating by the very ways we are living our lives. The Buddha himself, however, did keep looking and finally realized he needed to leave this. Physically, leave this world of luxury and power and physically break from it. He then began, at first, going to different masters who told him to exercise these incredibly horrific levels of asceticism and destruction of the body to break himself of all of his desires, which he realized over time actually was not working. And he realized actually it was about training the mind, or retraining the mind. Training the mind through disciplined activities, meditation, but not the kind of sort of vicious, bodily destructive meditations he had begun with, but using meditation to properly train the mind such that he would cease living his life according to the will, the desire, and therefore the endless suffering. Training himself to see the ways that our actions in the world are creating suffering, and training himself by seeing those to sense how to help those of us who are doing so, namely everyone else, how to work with them to help break them of the horrible suffering they were creating in their lives. This will entail, for the Buddha, different acts of being in the world to help us. Some of us will be called upon to physically leave the social world, our families, exactly as he did, breaking from all of this. That is not, however, the only path. Others of us can work within the worlds we are in, but constantly trying to train ourselves to see that we are in fact creating suffering all the time. And once we begin doing this, slowly, the argument is, we can begin breaking this illusory world of sheer suffering that we have created, however many eons ago this began, and begin to create a world, on the contrary, where we could achieve enlightenment. Now, let me simply conclude by emphasizing how strongly and powerfully this tradition is going to emphasize the issues that I've just mentioned. And the reason I want to close with this is there's recently been a very domesticated form of these ideas that you're seeing very commonly in America that involves some dangers if we assume that this is really talking about what they mean by breaking the self. And I'll just give an example. I mentioned this in our second class, but just to give a little bit more depth to it, you can see, there are actually several in Cambridge, meditation centers that you can walk by that will literally have in the window statements like, practice meditation and learn to love and embrace your true self. And they will advertise, come to us and we'll teach you meditation, and it'll teach you to calm yourself and be less anxious. And they will literally say, in their websites you can see this, and this will allow you to then go back to a normal life less anxious, and you'll be a more productive figure in American society, and a more effective capitalist because you'll be more calm, and you won't be as bothered by things. Intriguingly or chillingly, people who have done this, there have been all sorts of studies of people who thought this was the case, bought the ads, and started doing this, and they've started having intensely complex psychological difficulties because they had a teacher saying, okay, meditate and you'll be more calm, and lo and behold, you don't become calm when you start meditating. You ultimately do, as I'll mention, but initially you don't, because these techniques, which are very effective, they were designed to break yourself, to break the sense that I have this inherent self. You're destroying that. And it is psychologically devastating if you don't have a teacher there saying, I'm working with you to destroy the self and break your assumptions about what kind of a world you're living in. If you have a teacher there saying, okay, you're going to feel really good, you're not going to feel really good. You really won't. That's not the point of this. You're breaking the self. Now, when you break the self, which is a terrifying thing to do, what you then start being able to do is to gain a sense of what it would truly mean to see the world as endless flux, to see how to help and care for every sentient being, to see the degrees to which our everyday actions are creating endless suffering. And so the goal of the exercise is not to allow you to be happier and more content in the life you're already leading. It's to break the life you are currently leading, break the self that you think you are, and break the way you are acting in this world. So as you can see, it's a tradition that cuts almost purely, it's almost the flawless opposite of the first tradition we've been discussing. And even with Confucianism, there is, despite a lot of similarities and some opening claims about the self that we have constructed, ultimately this is going to be pushing in a very, very different direction with dramatic implications. So when you read these texts, as we're asking you to do, don't allow your eyes sort of to domesticate some of the terminology, which I think has become a danger by the way it's been domesticated in contemporary America. These are terrifying ideas, and they're intended to be terrifying. They are intended to challenge at a very deep level and break your most fundamental assumptions. And we're asking for you to, as always, take them seriously. You don't have to agree with them. Initially, they wouldn't be things you would, they are written to be agreed with immediately, to put it mildly. They're written to challenge you, but at least take them seriously to the point where you will allow yourself to be challenged by them and think through the implications of what it would mean to take these ideas in terms of what they are really trying to do. And did you want to give a response, and then we'll
No,
open
so
things up next week?
I think what I do is I begin next week with an account of a different version of these ideas, which is Schopenhauer's philosophy.
Absolutely.
And maybe I'll just signal ahead some of the themes in that account to direct your reflection on these ideas. So first, what are the permanent prompts to this view from our experience? There are essentially three. One is the experience that everything is evanescent. Everything is turning into everything else. It's this experience of pervasive transformation in a world of the ephemeral. Now, the second prompt is the experience of consciousness, which has no boundaries. So the world is a world of distinction, of apparent distinction, but consciousness seems to be unified. The third prompt is the ordeal of insatiability, desire, perpetual desire, and resulting in violence and struggle. Schopenhauer remarks that at any given moment, countless numbers of animals are tearing themselves apart alive to live a little longer. Now, then there's the metaphysical conception that responds to this prompt. And the metaphysical conception is ultimate reality is unified, is a unified being. And this unified being, underlying all the superficial distinctions in the world, is itself timeless. And salvation consists in establishing contact with this source of reality. Now, there are two great questions about this metaphysical view, and they're related. The first question is, if reality is unified and timeless, why does it disguise itself? And why does it appear to us in a form that is opposite to its true nature? Why? Now, the second question is, why should we associate reality with timelessness? What appears to be the case is mutable, but why is it less real because it's mutable? Maybe everything that's real is ephemeral. Why does it therefore cease being real? Why associate reality with eternity? And these two enigmas are connected. Because if we disassociated reality from eternity, we wouldn't have that enigma of why the real unified world appears under a false disguise. Now then, the third great theme in the discussion is the practical response to this situation in which we're in the coils of time and distinction, suffering insatiability under the shadow of mortality, of death. And there are three responses. One is the discipline of the mind. Cast a spell on yourself to disengage yourself from these coils of the ephemeral and temporal world. The second response is struggle for a detached view of the world, which overcomes the will. A will-less view of the world as an art. And the third is universal benevolence from a detached and serene point of view, recognizing your kinship with everything. Now, what's the problem? Put in a sharp form, the problem is this. It's as if you were to say, the solution to this circumstance of being tormented by mortality and insatiability is to die beforehand. So it's as if you were to say, disengage or engage only by immersing yourself in this oceanic, timeless and universal being, which is the same thing as disengaging. And what's that? That's death. And so there seems to be something wrong with this idea that the solution